Ahora vamos a dar comienzo a la charla del doctor Christopher Lingle, llamada Demand for Money in a Globalized Fiat Money World.
I don't blame you. I wouldn't be here perhaps if I had a choice, but to hear this. Partly, anyway, I want to thank this fine university for these wonderful facilities. I've been here before. This Congress has gotten better and better each time with Federico and his Bates colleagues. And I want to thank CMT Group, the corporate management guys that helped sponsor this, and the Naumann Stiftung for their contribution. So thanks to the sponsors. I was really honored to be on this program. When I looked at the impressive names of the people who I know and some of you who I've met. But what I'm most impressed by are the young people that I've never met before, and by the number of people who've shown interest in these ideas. And it gives me some great optimism and enthusiasm for what we might expect, at least within the academic community in Argentina, if not in the policy arena. So I applaud you, those of you who decided to give up your coffee break to come here, and thanks for that. And I'll try to make it worthwhile. On the Spanish language program, they had the correct title. On the English language program, they had another title, which I will actually marry into this one a bit, which deals with sound money. But I'm coming to you today with basically a puzzle of my own. I don't have an answer for all of this, and I, again, like some of the other speakers, I hope to stimulate a debate or at least some responses. But we live in a strange new world now, and in a world that was not conceived by these great scholars that we've spoken about, the early Austrian scholars in particular, as well as some of the others that we may have had less laudatory comments about, Keynes or Friedman and the mainstream economists. The world we live in is fundamentally different than the models that we live with today, I believe, and this is part of what I'm asking. So this idea is that what is the demand for money, and does it matter in a world that now is based upon a globalized fiat currency with massive and extensive globalization, meaning capital flows and trade flows on a scale and volume that we've never seen before. My email address is there if anybody wants to jot it down. If you have questions or complaints or criticisms, I'll be happy to entertain them by email. I'm proud to be able to claim that I have some association with Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala, as many of my great friends here have as well. So if you don't know about Francisco Marroquin University, I'll be happy to talk to you about it sometime over lunch. Okay, well, let's see what we can do here. Now, so this is this brave new world I was just alluding to. We live in a world without commodity standards. Now, this is because primarily the United States, the gringo, has defaulted. We defaulted twice, and these are not normally considered defaults, but in my understanding of a default, anytime there's a unilateral action on a contract, it's basically a default. So we had two defaults in terms of the gold standard. The classical gold standard came pretty much to an end by an executive order issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. It was followed up by some legislation that basically, in a sense, nationalized the gold standard in the U.S. In fact, criminalized the ownership of gold for reasons other than jewelry or collections. So you could literally go to prison for the dangerous activity of owning gold. And you would be subject to massive fines, which in today's terms would be probably in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, for this dangerous act of owning gold as a hedge or against inflation or uncertainty. Now, another evil man, Richard Nixon, ended the international tradability of the dollar against gold. So Roosevelt ended the domestic tradability of gold against the dollar. And Nixon in 1971, August 15th, 1971, I remember hearing it on TV, he closed the gold window. In other words, the perfidious French were demanding gold for the dollars they were accumulating, and the U.S. gold stock was being threatened because they were inflating the currency to pay for the Vietnam War in particular and other government expenditures. So since 1971, there is no significant country with a significant economy that is on a gold standard or a commodity standard. So here we are. We've got a globalized fiat money regime. This is the brave new world. Now, when Menger, when Mises, when Hayek, when Friedman, when Keynes were imagining the world, in the back of their mind or from their daily experience, they lived in a commodity money world. And their development of their monetary theories and those theories that were built upon them reflect that, I believe. And this is really my question. Does that matter? Now, what is a fiat money regime? Well, we have an infinitely elastic supply of money. There's no explicit constraint. The amount of money is simply dependent upon the capacity of the central bank to keep enough paper and ink available to do so. This is irredeemable paper money. So that means there's a very weak restraint on what I would call monetary misbehavior. That is, for central banks to let things get out of hand. Now, one of the things I tell my students, I said, look, when I was a graduate student studying monetary theory and from Chicago school economists, if I had approached my professor and said, Professor, I've looked into the future, and I see that in the future that it will be considered good monetary policy to keep interest rates almost at zero for an extended period of time, massively expanding the monetary base and the money supply. They would have probably called the campus police and had me escorted off the campus because they would have thought I was a dangerous lunatic. And of course, I would have received an F immediately in the course because I was of no use to them as a potential scholar. But today, PhDs from MIT, Harvard, Chicago, perhaps even, this passes as good policy, and it's unquestioned. So there were these. Now, how did we get there? I mean, and why did it take so long? Because by 1971, all bets were off. They could have inflated the money supply as much as they wanted. And I just have my own partial explanation for this. It's partly because the central bankers were partly the guys before me and then my generation that also had in the back of their mind these kind of restraints. That we don't want to behave that irresponsibly, at least in the central banks of the advanced economies that were committed to some sense of price stability. So there was this implicit constraint, maybe what you could call a psychological constraint. But over time, I don't know if any of you have children, but sometimes you tell them, don't touch that, and the child will, don't touch that, and they keep trying, and then as long as they get away with it, they keep going and going and going. And I think this is where we got with unconventional monetary policy, that these guys kept saying, God, nothing happened. Oh, it wasn't as bad as they said it was. We can do it. We can go. And so we lost this sort of implicit constraint that I think was based upon, as I say, what I learned, central bankers, at least, again, in the, and I think Milton Friedman's concept of a central banker was a somewhat upright chap, at least in the industrialized world, that could be reasoned with. But I think that was lost over time. Now what we have is that almost all central banks of any sort of concern to us tend to follow the U.S. Federal Reserve. Now, they don't ring up and say, hey, what are you guys going to do? They don't meet in some cabal and decide on this. It's simply they're driven by their own internal policy dynamics to follow the Fed, to synchronize with the Fed. And a lot of it has to do with export-led development policy and this mercantilist dream that, you want to keep your exchange rate undervalued, or you want to keep it synchronized with the United States so you don't lose export competitiveness and all of that. Now, in the old days, central bankers, even if they weren't independent from their political masters, we used to complain in the past about a lack of central bank independence because they would give in to democratic impulses. They were not independent from the market, because the market would punish central banks eventually, or the countries and the currencies of those central banks, if they were out of sync with everyone else. So, and there were prices to pay. So, for example, you would either have currency depreciations or adverse international flows, massive inflows of capital, massive outflows of capital, those sorts of things. So there was a price to be paid if you acted independently. So countries like Argentina, if you were misbehaving, and of course this would be reflected in exchange rates and so on. But much of that has disappeared because now people are beginning to move pretty much in sync. So that sort of, the punitive measures of the market for monetary misbehavior have been diluted substantially. Now, I think, globalization is another element of this. We've got these massive inflows and outflows of capital. The so-called carry trade is a very important element here. I'll speak about that briefly in a moment. And then the increased use of electronic transfer and credit card payments. So keep these things in mind, these three things. So we've got this globalized monetary system, this globalization impacting on trade and finance, and a new, our experience with banks and financial intermediaries is simply different than it ever was before. So, of course, Menger didn't know this, couldn't see it. Hayek, Mises, Friedman, whoever, and Keynes, of course. So I think we all need to, I'm asking if we need to rethink a lot of this stuff. And I'm going to start with the demand for money, because I wonder, do our current monetary macroeconomic theory, will they lead us to a good end? The short answer, I think, is no. But it begs, and I think the evidence of today is no. But I think we have a lot worse news in front of us. Now, so I'm going to start with the demand for money, because it turns out that the demand for money is really a critical component in most monetary theory and macro theory. It may not be the point of it, and it may not be the only element, but it's certainly an important element, at least as I see it in terms of some of the policy consequences and some of the things that we're told about what we should expect. So are the current theories, now it could be, a good theory works under many conditions. That's what it's meant to be, a generalized theory. So it could be I'm wrong, and I may well be wrong. I kept telling people, I said, I don't know if what I'm talking about is completely banal and uninteresting, or it's earth-shattering. And I don't think I'm capable of coming up with really important things, so I'm afraid it may be banal and simply a footnote, maybe something we could have discussed over coffee. But I suspect that I could be right, that it is, at least it may be another point of attack on some of the current macro policies and monetary policies. And therefore I'm saying, has a misunderstanding, a misapplication of a concept that I'm going to suggest may not be appropriate in a fiat money world. So talking about the demand for money, which was based upon a conceptualization of money as a commodity or that was tradable into a commodity, as in a gold standard. Is this what's behind the monetary madness that I see out there? Because I really think there's something bordering on madness among these central bankers. They're in denial about their impact upon booms and busts. They're in denial about their role in creating bubbles. And they're irresponsible in not being able to anticipate that when they dig themselves into a hole as deep as they've dug themselves now with the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve System, acquiring a massive amount of expanding their balance sheet by multiples that are staggering. They don't see the dangers out there. And I think part of it is, I think demand for money is part of that. It may not be the whole thing. So let's see what's going on here. It seems to me that the demand for money, the impact of changes in demand for money depends on the monetary regime. Under a commodity standard, we're told generally that if there's an increased demand for money, then we'll expect the natural rate of interest to rise. Okay? Whoops. Well, I got too much there. So under a commodity standard, gold is money, money is gold. They're perfectly transferable, and it's sort of a classical gold standard. So if you withhold money, so in other words, you put it into a little box, you're taking it out of circulation. Now, you're doing that for whatever reason. Either you're protecting, you're hedging against instability or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But you're removing that from circulation. So in that sense, the term that Keynes used and many other people, this idea of hoarding, that you're withholding, this matters. It has consequences. Now, under a fiat money standard, I suspect this whole idea is much different. Because what happens is that if there's an increased demand for money, what we tend to see is that central bankers say, we need more paper money. Okay? And they're not constrained. So an increased demand for money drives the money supply to a certain extent because they're constantly monitoring that. But it turns out that in a fiat money system, why would you hold idle balances? Why would you put money in a box? Well, if you're a narcotraficante, you have it in the wall or... Now, okay, but you would desperately love to have it out of the wall. You'd love to have it in the banking system. Given a moment's opportunity that you would do that. So there's a weak incentive to hold large amounts of money or, significant amounts of money outside the system. Whereas if you, in a gold standard, you're maintaining your wealth as gold outside the system. Well, with paper money, you're going to be holding, in almost every instance in the modern world, a depreciating asset, even if it's in the bank. But certainly it's even worse outside the banking system, unless you have euros, whereas now you'll pay, and there's a negative nominal interest rate on euro balances, so you're actually better off now to keep your money out of a bank if you're having euros. Now, so what we find then is that most money is either deposited in the financial intermediary, or in the case of the U.S., it's outside the U.S. If paper money, somewhere 60% of the total dollars circulate outside the U.S. because people in gringos, we use credit cards or debit cards. Most of the transactions are done electronically. And much of the global foreign exchange reserves are held in the form of dollars or dollar-denominated assets, but there are certainly a lot of physical dollars as well. Now, let's think about what the demand for money is meant to be. George Selgin, referring to Keynes, makes it very clear here. It's simply hoarding. A demand for money means you're holding cash. It's what you have in your pocket. It's what you have in your shoebox. It's what you have in your mattress. Okay, and Selgin focuses in his interest is the inside money. That is, the money from the created by the banking system. So the demand for money can be measured either as a stock, that would be the cash balances, or a flow, where as monetary payments adjusted for increased price levels, so that we're looking at real balances. And the idea was that, why would you hold money? Well, there are lots of reasons we talk about, but to a considerable degree, we're concerned about future conditions. Now, again, that idea makes more sense under a gold standard, right? Because somehow you can protect yourself more readily under a gold standard. You withdraw your gold coins. Maybe gold certificates, probably more people would take gold coins because it's physical gold. Now, a paper money system. Paper money systems, future expectations are almost always going to be what the monetarists would call inflationary. That is, the price level trends up in all paper money systems. So, what's the incentive to hold money in under conditions of expected higher prices? So, again, I'm sensing here that there's something going on that we're not catching here with respect to the demand for money. An increased demand for money, holding more cash balances due to greater uncertainty of rising, say, deflationary expectations. That would be a good reason to hold money, right? Because if you think prices will go down in the future, or that there'll be a higher valued monetary unit in the future, you might hold money balances. That would lead to lower planned future expenditures because of that. Now, that makes sense in the gold standard. But despite all the rhetoric, we don't see anything like deflation, price deflation in the real world. There's all kinds of claims that this is a problem. We'll look at Japan, which Japan supposedly is the place where we have the biggest problem. Europe, number 2, and then the gringo cries about it a lot too, but it's imaginary, I think. Now, immediately people say, yeah, but what I learned about the demand for money is the inverse. The inverse of the demand for money is the velocity of circulation. And the velocity of circulation has been falling, which should suggest that the demand for money is rising. But I've got a different explanation for this, and it's one that I think is consistent with our observations. Velocity of money is falling primarily because of the conditions set by the central bank, the monetary central planning of all the major central banks, the big 4, Bank of England, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, the U.S., Federal Reserve, has created perverse incentives such that much of the money that is available goes into financial sector activities. Banks are holding enormous excess reserves. But think about it. You want a loan to me? I come into your bank. I'm some guy that comes in with a business model. I have to lay this business model out to you. I have to explain to you my collateral. I have to give you some estimates of my long-term earnings potential. Somebody has to evaluate that. You've got to have lawyers on your staff, or you hire one guy to buy U.S. government bonds. What are you going to do? This is costly and risky. I'm not going to loan you money for your imaginary business plan. You're too much trouble. So here we go. Buy government bonds. So now we got a bubble in the government bond sector. We've got a bubble in the financial sectors in the United States, in particular in the stock market. Or we have massive amounts of money being used in the carry trade, where you go in to Japan, you borrow for less than around 1%, convert the yen into Indonesian rupiah, and you buy a government bond at 9%. exchange rate risk, it's there, but that's a huge spread. So what we have is what I call the financialization of the economy. This is why velocity is going down, I believe. So the impact of this monetary misbehavior is not being felt in the real sector. In fact, the real sector is being punished, being depressed. So we're not seeing price inflation. And they're saying, hey, we're doing the right thing. Prices aren't rising. Consumer prices aren't rising. So the central banks pat themselves on the back and say, we must be doing the right thing. Because as we will see, the primary metric of all central bankers is what's happening in consumer price index. It's okay, we're okay. So this is, I think, again, why I wonder. Many people look at this and say, well, it's still all about the demand for money. Well, I'm not sure. Not the demand for money in the conventional sense. Falling velocity is about the financialization of the economy. That is a diversion of resources from the real sector into the financial sector. So what we have, so here's the velocity of money, and everybody can see clearly it's going down. And again, the conventional view of this is that, well, that's a demand for money issue. And it also could be explained in part. You say, well, banks aren't lending. They've got massive foreign excess reserve. The money multiplier's been on this downward slope and a steep drop. And again, what we see in this area is this idiocy of zero interest rate policy, which has induced banks to pile into low risk, low cost financial assets. Or those with, and so what we have here are two really interesting explanations. Why aren't these economies growing? Well, there's not much inducement. The real sector is not going to grow unless they have access to lending. And maybe that's a good thing, given what we know as those who identify with the Austrian school. We would have massive malinvestments in the future. So maybe that's a good news part of that story. So anyway, we see all these things, but if we interpret them through the lens of the 19th century, that, again, I grew up with all that, even though I didn't, well, there was a gold standard. I was in graduate school in 71, so it was a international gold standard. So, these things stick around in your mind for a long time, and you don't give them up. So let's look at the different views on monetary theory. I'm inspired by, I shouldn't bring up Adrian's name because he can't take credit or blame for any of this, but he told me that when he was a graduate student, one of his professors always would say, well, this is the Keynesian view, this is the monetarist view, and this is the Austrian view. So I'm going to approach this. He wouldn't help me at all in filling in these blanks. So he can't take credit or blame for this. But I asked him to help me with the Austrian side, but it seems like, oh, there he is. Anyway, so those of you who know about Keynes's lifestyle, I mean, he liked to have it both ways. And it seems the same with interest rates. If you read the general theory, interest rates determine liquidity preference. Okay, so interest rates determine liquidity preference. But then you read on and it said, oh, well, no, the demand for money and the supply of money, they determine the market rate of interest. Well, so he's trying to have it both ways here. High liquidity preference, demand for money, leads to insufficient aggregate demand. So here it plays an important role in macroeconomic analysis, and thus eventually to macroeconomic policymakers. They say, Keynes told us if there's too much money being held outside the system, there'll be insufficient aggregate demand. This will lead to systemic price deflation. Okay? So this, what happened? Okay. And then we go on to, what's going on? Sorry. Then we go on to the liquidity trap. We have an infinitely interest elastic demand for money balances. The state must and can and must run fiscal deficits to solve the problem for us. stimulate the economy. So again, the liquidity trap, this wonderful concept of Keynes, is the demand for money plays a role in this, and thus, by implication, the demand for money plays a role in the argument for government fiscal deficits as a stimulus policy. And we look briefly at the monetarists. So we got two types of managers here. We've got an aggregate demand manager or planner. In the Keynesians, then we have money supply managers, money supply planners, central planners in a sense, that are planning these sort of centralized decisions. So then we have the quantity theory. The demand for money comes into the quantity theory, and the V term there, the velocity, demand for money is the inverse of the demand for money is the inverse of velocity. And then we have this nice linearity, this sort of mechanistic interpretation that, again, in real theory, the theory that's done among academics, it's a much more complex argument, but primarily we wind up with, and Friedman denied that he talked about the long-run neutrality of money, but it all works as though he did believe in it. So if we have an insufficient monetary policy response to a sudden rise in the demand for money, there we got deflation again. And again, what are the central bankers using as an excuse to maintain this ultra-loose monetary policy? Deflation. Or, I love this one, lowflation. That's the European lowflation. Inflation is too low. Anyway, tell me that one. Now, Friedman focused on price level stability as an equilibrium between the supply and demand for money. The choice of holding cash was a sort of a generalized choice problem based on Friedman's permanent income hypothesis. Then we have the monetarist position is not significantly different from the Keynesian position on this, which led Patinkin and other people to accuse Friedman of being a Keynesian, and I'm okay with that. But I'm not offended by that, although I grew up a monetarist. Now, so we got the interest rate is determined by the intersection of supply and demand for loanable funds, not supply and demand for money, but loanable funds within the banking system. So it's sort of an inside money thing. Opportunity costs of cash balances drive the demand for money here. Now let's look at Austrians, and this is what I wanted Adrian to help me with, and he wouldn't, so if I screw it up, I may blame him later. But now the Austrians are not planners, at least not central planners. They don't plan the aggregate demand function. They don't plan the money supply function. Okay, they're more interested in the micro perspective. Mises talked about the demand for money as a reflection of individuals' marginal utility of cash relative to other goods. So again, the focus then is we move away from these sort of aggregate concepts, aggregate demand, price levels, to understanding the demand for money from the individual perspective. And unlike the monetarists, the Austrians are deeply concerned with relative prices rather than price levels. So time preference then would come in here, and this is where again I often say I'm an accidental Austrian because unlike many of you, I wasn't, and it may show, I suppose, I wasn't trained to be an Austrian. I chose to become one, and I tried to unlearn all the monetarist influences, or at least to somehow accommodate them, so that if I get this wrong, I'll be happy to absorb questions or criticisms. So basically, in this sense, we see interest rates as the price of time, a way of discounting the future, which again is not, I don't know that in a discussion of an isolated element like this that the monetarists or Keynesians would disagree with that per se as a conceptual process, but they won't apply it as rigorously or as consistently as the Austrians would. So time preference here is seen as a category of human action that are trying to bring people's sort of goals closer in time. The implication is you have a positive time preference. We all most of us know this, that you prefer satisfaction sooner rather than later. You tend to smooth the consumption pattern over time. So I always tell my students that, young people are high discounters. You need to, compensate them more. I mean, they want to consume now. They tend to be, I think this challenges some aspect of the time preference theory, but I try to explain it within that. But the discount rate has to be much higher for them to forego, teen pregnancies, hangovers. I mean, these things happen to young people because they don't discount properly, or they tend to have a much greater urgency for sooner rather than later. Now, so we've got this intertemporal allocation of money income, which includes choices about how much money you might hold. This leads to a positive interest rate on loans and monetary investments that will move into the productive stream. Now, so again, just stress here that mainstream economists tend to be more concerned with macroeconomic variables and aggregates, in other words, whereas now, I suspect they all have it wrong. Partly for, as I said, historical reasons, historical experiences. So I don't know that the Austrians necessarily come up with better answers about the demand for money as I'm trying to conceptualize it here. But I think on balance, they come up with better answers for other things. But I'm not sure that we're there with respect to the demand for money per se. Okay, now, so what do we know? We know monetary theory is trying to give us some predictions about what will happen if things happen to money supply or money demand in particular. One of the bedrock conclusions of monetary theory: an excessive increase or decrease in the rate of growth of money supply will have consequences. There'll either be a rising or falling value of the purchasing power of money. In other words, CPI. Now, Austrians understand this. I mean, I think we should be more concerned with how the rates of growth of money supply affect credit availability, and they then lead to malinvestments. That's a much more important contribution of the Austrians in that regard. And I think price inflation is of secondary concern. And it certainly is at the moment. Price inflation seems to be of secondary concern to us. So what we see is that central banks have vastly increased most monetary measures without... Now, this is an interesting problem. 4 years ago when I was here, there was this woman that was Beatriz, what was the central bank governor, this woman? I don't remember her name. Okay. Now, she said, the rates of growth of money supply have nothing to do with price inflation. Central banker. Now, I mean, someone who was raised as a monetarist, this was quite surprising to me. But the interesting thing is now, she can actually, well, she's out now, I know. But the current central bankers are saying the same thing. And they're saying it because the gringos screwed things up. And so now they can validate their stupidity by saying, well, it's evident. We've been saying this all along. We're not causing price inflation. Look what's happening in the U.S. or what's happening in Japan. So this is an interesting problem here. The central bank policies and these realities are now being used to completely distort what has been an understanding of the relationship between rates of growth of money supply and consumer price indexes. And as I told you, I think the explanation for that is this financialization of the economy. That is, we've got this diversion of resources in the financial sector. Now, it seems to me that central bankers really don't get it. This is like Freddy Krueger to the central bankers. You know, deflation, price deflation. I mean, this is wonderful. I don't know how this gets by, but they say people will stop consuming. Well, wait a minute. Stop consuming what, how much, and for how long? No, but, you know, again, the journalistic sort of presentation of this, Price deflation is so dangerous because people will stop consuming. They'll delay consumption. Well, what, again, it's maybe an empirical question. What amount of consumption will they delay? I mean, your car breaks down. You have to replace your car. You say, I'm going to wait around 5 years, 5 months, 5 days, 5 weeks to replace it. No. You replace things. So a lot of consumption behavior is going to be unaffected by that. You're going to stop eating. I'm going to wait till the next harvest. Maybe the prices will go down. You know, again, you know, a 12-year-old child would challenge some of these, certainly the journalistic presentations of these ideas. Now, Japan is supposedly, now, don't forget, Japan had the classic Austrian boom-bust cycle. 1980s, the price of land in Tokyo, the valuation of the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than all the real estate in California. That's a bubble. It blew up, and since 1989, the Japanese economy has been in a low growth or no growth recession perpetually with these momentary, I get no end of amusement out of reading recovery in Japan. Well, you just wait about 5 minutes and they go, oh my God, we're not recovering. Now, so they've been talking about, and Japan has been, they were an innovator with unconventional monetary policy. They were one of the first large central banks that went into zero interest rate policy. They bought into non-government assets to put them on their balance sheet. They were buying up junk bonds before the Federal Reserve was, toxic assets and so on. And based upon trying to avert or avoid price deflation. But it hasn't been there. Japan's CPI has fallen by about 0.5% over 20 years. That's not, oh wow, that's not significant. And they've been doing all kinds of crazy things. Well, this is the U.S. monetary base here. We see, again, monetary madness. Japan. Whoop. I keep doing. We're at Japan's monetary base in 2012. It's more than doubled in a very short period of time. Now, again, in my graduate studies in monetary theory, everybody would be running for the door, be terrified. M1 has gone up by a factor of 6 since 1990. Now, remember the date I gave you? The bursting, the Japanese bubble was 1989. And since then, they've raised the M1 by a factor of 6 with no effect. Primarily because I think that Japan's going through much of the same kind of, for different reasons. I mean, there are other reasons in Japan. But, you know, this sort of financialization issues there. Now, so what we've got, how do you get out of this? I mean, I think the demand for money has something to do with all of this. That is the justifications for fiscal policies, fiscal stimulus, fiscal deficits, and for monetary policy, because the monetary authorities, going back and looking at the old conceptualizations of demand for money, have gotten us into these messes. Look, you know, we got this massive. So how do we get out of it? Well, you know, I don't know, but look at this. This is the Federal Reserve's. This is their capital base, and these are their, well, assets. Well, this is. You remember toxic. These toxic assets that supposedly brought the world financial sector almost to its knees. Well, this is what's on the balance sheet primarily, or to a great extent. 78 times. So this leveraging is just breathtaking. How do you get out of that? You know, what? Well, I mean, it's basically an Alfred E. Newman, you know, Mad Magazine. Is anybody? You're too young for that. There was a character that said, "What me worried?" You know? These guys, they don't know. They don't get it. They don't have an exit strategy. They talk about that they need one, but they really don't have one because they don't know how they got there or what the consequences will be. I don't think. So part of the problem in the U.S. is that the central bank has a dual mandate. They have to look at unemployment rates and implicitly aggregate demand, as well as price stability. Well, so we've got the speculators using cheap credit, and we get the same sort of Austrian cycle there. Now, they think it works. This has been going on for a long time in Japan since 1989. Now, if you go back and read history, people tried desperately to find perpetual motion machines. It's as though people believe that central banks have found one. We're living in a world, again, of monetary madness where people actually believe that this is going to work forever and without consequences. So what can they do? Well, I mean, I don't know. There are other options here, but eventually we may see it in other countries, capital controls and price inflation. That's going to be the exit strategy. It's not going to be, because if they try to sell off those assets that they are holding, the capacity of any central bank, even the United States central bank, to maintain control over interest rates when the market starts turning against them, it's going to be impossible. Interest rates will just get out of hand. I'm convinced of that. There'll be a point in which lenders are just simply going to say, I'm not lending at that. This is what happened in Argentina with the crisis with the currency board that we talked about earlier. People finally said, well, they're not going to be able to pay back that money. They're not going to be able to service the debt given the tax revenue inflows. So we demand a higher interest rate or we won't lend. Okay, just very quickly then. This is the problem with central bankers here. They got a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So they're only concerned about consumer price indexes. And they're digging themselves into a deeper and deeper hole because they don't see enough movement in consumer price index. Lowflation, deflationary expectations and all that. So they just keep pumping in money as though it didn't matter, as though it won't have long-term consequences. And as it won't matter that central banks are sitting on trillions of dollars in the United States of excess reserves, that those are just going to, that Paul Krugman is going to encourage the U.S. government to issue a $1 trillion coin, and that will just take care of it. I mean, this is monetary madness. The market monitors don't hold us, don't give us much choice because they just want to change one aggregate for another. Instead of, inflation targeting or interest rate targeting, they say, oh, nominal GDP targeting. Ask Mark how good that idea is just from the standpoint of GDP without looking at the other aspects. The deflationary spiral is the most dangerous risk that is being presented to us. This is the big problem. This is what these guys are selling to us. And I mentioned this before about Japan. So even if there is a sharp price fall, what will happen is that bondholders may expect governments to default. They'll sell off their bonds, and when they sell off their bonds, what will happen to interest rate? Interest rate will spike. Or they'll buy other currencies, and that will end the spiral. So we do know that there are market responses to these deflationary conditions. I think there's substantial evidence that the central banks have put us into a situation where it's going to be very difficult. The market response to these conditions is going to be ugly. I hate to end on a bad note, but the bad news is there's so much more bad news out there that 2007, 2008 may look like a picnic. We're in that deep. Well, anyway, so it's time for questions. Thank you very much.